The morning of the 10th of November, and these are my real memories, we were having breakfast in our house. And our house was sort of a compound. There was our house, there was a courtyard, and then there was a factory and a large shop. My father ran the factory floor. My mother ran the business and the shop. They had been over there early, but then came back to breakfast. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, had walked down from her small apartment further up the road to have breakfast with us and take care of me during the day. We also had a housekeeper, and we had a nanny, whom the nanny I liked. The housekeeper was rather scary because she told me off very often. I remember that. But suddenly, later on, this is my father told me later on, that he had heard some rumors already from the night before that there had been some disturbances in Munich and in Berlin. But he still didn't seem to be a very calm person. But then, during breakfast, there was suddenly this enormous noise, and I do remember this well. These large trucks driving up and down the street. And our street was a rather quiet street, but just off one of the main shopping streets. When we looked out of the window, these trucks were loaded up with very angry-looking men. I remember that too. I do remember that I had never seen anybody so angry and screaming so loud. Death to the Jews. Where is the Jew, Joseph Gold? Joseph Gold was my father. And I remember my father and mother rushing back to the business, and then you heard smashing sounds. And the smashing sounds grew louder and louder, and I didn't really understand it because I was 4.5 years old. I didn't really know what I was. I didn't know what they were talking about, kill the Jews. And my grandmother kept telling me, keep quiet and don't go near the window. But I didn't keep quiet, and I did go near the window. What else could you do at that age? And I saw them coming up to our house, banging on the door. Where is the Jew, Joseph Gold? We want to hang him from lamppost. But they didn't come in. But then some younger ones came along with paint, white paint. They painted swastikas all over the windows and the doors and Stars of David. And it later on said death to the Jews, which I didn't know because I wasn't even in school at that time. In the meantime, they had broken into the business, into the courtyard. They had absolutely smashed up the shop, trampled all the chocolates, pulled down the storage areas, and they were trying to get into the factory, where the windows had all been smashed. And the staff, in fact, and my father confronted them. And this often happens, and I've seen this in my life, bullies sometimes do back down, even though there were many of them. They back down. And I later asked my father, what did you think? Did they protect you because they liked you or because they were afraid of losing their job? And he always said, well, he said, I hope it's a bit of both. This went on for hours, and the trucks kept running up and down the street. There were several other businesses in the area which were equally smashed, but the noise was really unbelievable because the whole city was being smashed up. Further up the road, the main shopping street, there were some large department stores, small stores, you name it, totally smashed up. What happened then? From what I remember, everybody was very scared. I remember my mother had red eyes from so much crying. My grandmother, very calm woman, looked very firm and very strict. And she said, everything is all right. This is nothing to worry about. And I must admit that I wasn't really frightened. I was really very confused because it really seemed like something I had never seen before, and I wanted to know what it is. And I didn't understand it. And that was the scary part. Quite apart from those terribly, terribly angry people. I'd never seen anybody that angry, not even my mother or the housekeeper or my grandmother, when I did something wrong. So that was very, very scary and very confusing. And that's it. That's what I remember, because it is a marker in my life, because afterward, our life went down very steadily and very quickly. My father was arrested a day or so later, not immediately, and while he was in jail, he had to sign over the business to German ownership, and we were given orders to leave our premises within 36 hours, I think. So we had to go. We were not allowed to take anything. I think we were allowed to take clothing and personal effects we could carry, and we moved down the road into my grandmother's small apartment. Well, the rest, of course, is a series of long stories which I will not bother you with today. What happened, of course, we did survive. My mother eventually went to a labor camp where she survived. My father went through a series of concentration camps, Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Birkenau, the death march from Auschwitz to Mauthausen, where 100,000 people marched off in the winter on foot, and less 10,000 arrived. It took him 2 years to recover. I was very lucky. I was a hidden child. I was saved by good people. There is goodness in the world, and that is something which should not be forgotten. The only thing I want to leave you with is the great historian of the Holocaust, who was also Winston Churchill's biographer, Sir Martin Gilbert, whom I had the honor of knowing. In his book on Kristallnacht, he gave several conclusions. He said the first conclusion is that it should not be forgotten that a totally advanced and civilized country, through hatred, through media and politics, can descend into barbarism. That must not be forgotten. The second lesson, he said, there were many, many signs early telling Jews to get out, but they did not. By the time we wanted to get out, it was too late. And the third lesson he mentions is that when the Nazis tried Kristallnacht, it was really a tryout to see what would be the reaction of the world to what they were doing. And of course, the reaction was not really very good. The doors were closing all over the world to Jews who wanted to escape. Very few countries were interested in taking Jews. I must admit, if you look at the history of our country, Australia's history is not very good. I lived for many years in Canada. The Canadian history is not very good. The Canadian government had, in fact, a policy called one is too many. The United States, Roosevelt, had closed the doors. Only England, a couple of Asian countries, China, Shanghai, took Jews. So that gave Hitler, in fact, almost a license to say, we can now proceed on to the next part of my conquering the world, which, as you know, started 10 months later, because the world is really not going to do very much. One of the reasons why I agreed even to talk today, this morning on the radio and this evening here, is simply to say it should not be forgotten. Because if it can happen in Germany, it can happen anywhere. There are horrors everywhere in the world today, and somehow or other, we still seem to be able to turn our backs for convenience and for other reasons. We suffered terribly. My own family had over 60 people murdered. We managed to come out of it very damaged and hurt, but we survived. We came to this magnificent, sunny, free country, made our own life once again, but many others were not so lucky, and we must not forget them. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar, for sharing such painful personal memories and insights with us. Tonight, as part of our commemoration of Kristallnacht, we have inevitably looked at the past. But we need to focus on the future to ensure that the hatred that erupted in Kristallnacht and the ensuing Holocaust does not happen again. One of the most powerful tools of prevention, I believe, is education. We are fortunate tonight to have students of Brisbane College, their principal, and their teacher, Mrs. Strachan, present. These are students who participate in a program called Suspend Judgment, which provides a unique education about the Holocaust. The program was designed by Nadine Dixon to facilitate an understanding of the history of the Holocaust and enrich the learning of the students with integral lifelong lessons that are essential to humanity. The mission of the program is to engender the ability of individuals to suspend judgment in the hope that justice, dignity, courage, and compassion remain at the core of how we live our everyday lives. Suspend judgment is also an acknowledgement that negative judgment based on assumptions and accusations can cause horrific atrocities, like the Holocaust in the world. As part of the program, the students develop their own projects to portray their understanding of this event. In the entrance to the synagogue this evening, we have many of these projects on display, and I would encourage everybody to have a look at these. I'm also delighted to introduce to you this evening Rosie Pope, who will talk to us about her project entitled The Allegory of the Coin. Rosie.
Good evening, representatives of the Jewish Board, distinguished guests, members of the Jewish community. My name is Rosie Pope. I'm a high school student at Brisbane College, and I'm so honoured to have the opportunity to speak to you all tonight and present my learnings from the Suspend Judgment program. For my project, I created an abstract multimedia artwork titled The Allegory of the Coin. My project is deceptively simple. A porcelain jar of coins is filmed being dropped and smashed. However, the meaning behind the work is anything but. The jar and coins are symbolic of two concepts. The first is a metaphoric representation of the oppression and silencing of Jewish people during the Holocaust. The small, nondescript jar initially obscures the coins from view, much like the Nazis concealed the reality of the horrors they were inflicting on Jewish people. The moment of impact, when the jar shatters and the coins explode outwards, is representative of the aftermath of the Holocaust, when those who were held captive in concentration camps were set free. It also resembles the Jewish marital tradition of breaking a glass, a ritual often associated with the remembrance of the destruction of the first and second Jewish temples. And hence, my work is fittingly solemn in depicting the oppression and subsequent freedom of Jewish people. However, people are far more complicated than that, so freedom is never as simple as walking away from our oppressors. When working on the second symbolic concept of my work, two women's stories stuck out to me. The first was the testimony of Edith Eger, a Holocaust survivor who wrote the memoir, The Choice, Embrace the Impossible. She posed the question, do you want to be a driver or do you want to be driven? The second was the story of Susan Rettig, the widow of 9/11 victim David Rettig, who started the humanitarian organization Beyond the 11th that runs income-generating programs for Afghan widows and their children. These strong individuals have one thing in common. They use the power of choice not only to move forward from the horrific events that ruptured and displaced them and their families, but to make a positive impact on the world. Events of brutal oppression, such as Kristallnacht, which we commemorate tonight, inevitably shape our view of the world, but how we respond and what we learn from these terrible tragedies is up to us. Hence, the second concept that is evident in my work is the power of choice that the Jewish people obtained after the liberation of the concentration camps, and the power of choice that we all possess right now. When you flip a coin, it will land on either heads or tails. While it may appear to be pure chance, seemingly trivial factors like the friction on your hand and the air resistance can vastly impact the outcome. Similarly, every decision that we make, no matter how insignificant it may seem, compounds to form the people we are today. We have the power to make an immeasurable difference in the direction of our lives and the lives of others if we start making our decisions thoughtfully and ethically. Thus, the goal I hope to achieve with this artwork was to encourage us all to constantly think beyond the short-term, self-serving benefits of our own actions and consider how we can make the most of the freedom we have for the greater good. I dedicated this project to the inspiring late Eddie Jaku, a Holocaust survivor who emigrated to Australia in 1950 and passed away recently. One potent quote from his book, The Happiest Man on Earth, perfectly reflects the message that I wanted to encapsulate in my work. Eddie said, "Your efforts today will affect people you will never know. It is your choice whether that effect is positive or negative. You can choose every day, every minute, to act in a way that may uplift a stranger or else drag them down. The choice is easy, and it is yours to make. Thank you."
Thank you, Rosie. The next song by the choir is Found Tonight, adapted by Jacob Navarud.
Story of tonight.
Such beautiful words. Tomorrow there will be more of us telling the story of tonight. Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker of the evening, Professor Katharine Gelber. Katharine Gelber is head of the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences Australia, a former Australian Research Council Future Fellow, and a former president of the Australian Political Studies Association. Her expertise is in freedom of speech and speech regulation, with research projects into the regulation of hate speech, especially online, and other allegedly harmful speech. Professor Gelber will speak on hate speech and its consequences.
Thank you very much for the invitation this evening. I'm truly honoured to be here. I too would like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous owners of the land on which we meet this evening and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and especially to pay my respects to any Indigenous people here tonight. Tonight is the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht. I recently published a chapter on my family's history in the book Genocide Perspectives, edited by Kirill Shields and Nikki Marshak. The chapter focuses on items and materials I found in my father's belongings after he passed away in 2017 at the age of 91. He had been put on a kinder transport out of Vienna in 1938 at the age of 12, and as a child, and even for most of my adult life, I only knew the bare bones of that story, indeed not very much more than I have just told you. And then after he died, I discovered photographs, papers and memorabilia in his filing cabinet and on his bookshelf that I never knew existed. The exploration of these materials and what they meant to me when I discovered them led me to contemplate the status of being a second-generation storyteller. Eva Hoffman has famously discussed the importance of the guardianship of the Holocaust through the transmission of stories to and by the second generation, which she calls the hinge generation, in which received, transferred knowledge of events is being transmuted into history or into myth. She suggests that second generation stories of Holocaust survival help us to grapple with the horrors of that event, even as we instinctively recoil from them. Ephraim Zischer suggests that the obligation and difficulties of telling such stories have fallen to the second generation. He emphasises the obligation of storytelling in the context of ongoing risks of racism and anti-Semitism, which he described in 1998 as the new legitimacy of racist discourse in Europe. More than 20 years on, his warning is even more prescient, as racism and anti-Semitism appear to be on the rise globally. Well before I had started working out what those artefacts in my father's possession meant, or, incidentally, how they survived the war, which I still don't know, I had been working as a scholar and researcher on hate speech. An intimate connection has developed between the work that I do as a scholar and my status as a second-generation storyteller. I've worked for more than 25 years on hate speech since I wrote my PhD on the topic. And the first part of the work that I do is to challenge the notion that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. A more contemporary example, which some of you may be aware of, is Taylor Swift's song, "And the hater's gonna hate, 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 hate." She tells her audience to shake it off. I know that we tell that saying about sticks and stones to our children to help them recover from the hurt that they feel by being called names. But not all names are equal, and not all names can be easily recovered from. Sometimes names do hurt, just as much as sticks and stones. I've always felt that words have power, As a child, my parents used their words to teach me, to tell me off, to chastise me, to persuade me, to convince me. And all of us use words every day in ways that have power. If somebody knocks on the door of your office, you give them a verbal permission to come in, and if you don't say come in and they come in anyway, you think they're rather rude. When they do it in your house, if they knock on the door and you don't give them permission to enter, which we only do through words, then they may have even committed an illegal act. So we know that words can do things in the world, from that very small thing, such as giving somebody permission to enter a room, to much bigger things. For example, former President Trump's words leading up to, during and after the 2020 presidential election, his repeated lies about the stealing of the election led to the instigation of a riot in the Capitol building on the 6th of January that cost 5 people their lives. In May 2021, a majority of Republican voters still believed that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, and they continue to repeat baseless claims of illegal voting. This is in spite of the fact that the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency put out a statement in November 2020, along with state and local election officials, that stated very clearly with evidence that the 2020 election was America's most secure election in history. In that debate, we run the danger of truth coming to be meaningless, that the only thing that it matters is winning and holding power. I think what we're witnessing now is in fact a struggle over the very survival of the Republic. And Hannah Arendt warned us decades ago about the primacy of language in that struggle. She talked about the primacy of language in understanding the adherence of large numbers of people to incoherent or false beliefs. She said that once large masses of people have reached the point in which they do adhere to incoherent and false beliefs, she said they do not believe in anything visible, in the reality of their own experience. They do not trust their eyes and ears, but only their imaginations. What convinces them are not facts, and not even invented facts, but only the consistency of the system of which they are presumably a part. The consistency of the narrative, the consistency of the lies, the consistency of the speech matters, and that happens through its frequent repetition. She said totalitarian propaganda thrives on this escape from reality into fiction. So words can do a lot. We also know, of course, that words can't do everything. To give just a brief example, until recently in Australia, if 2 people gathered with a legally authorised celebrant, said the right words and undertook the right ritual, whether or not a marriage was solemnised with, of course, attendant legal consequences, depended on the gender identity of the 2 people wanting to marry. So context does matter. Context matters in terms of whether words can achieve the ends that the speaker intends them to achieve, or even can achieve an end that the speaker may not intend, but which is facilitated by the context in which the speech takes place. That's why, for example, we recoil when people use the disclaimer, "It was only a joke," to try to defend themselves in an unpersuasive way, for example, for making a racist or sexist comment. In the end, it actually doesn't really matter whether the speaker intended the comment to be racist or not. What matters is that the context within which it occurred, if that context meant that the comment was going to replicate racism, then that's what it does in that context, sometimes regardless of the intention of the speaker. So context matters a lot. It can matter just as much as, if not more than, the stated intention of the speaker. So in a context within which anti-Semitism exists, words that replicate the scourge of anti-Semitism do the work of perpetuating and legitimating anti-Semitism and attendant attitudes and behaviour towards Jews. we tend to term that hate speech, but I think the term hate speech is very poorly understood. Some people take it to mean expressing hatred or dislike towards somebody, but I think this is wrong. Hate speech actually doesn't have anything to do with disliking somebody. You can dislike someone and say so, and in a legal sense or in a philosophical sense, that doesn't mean that you've engaged in hate speech. And in some cases, you can say you love somebody, but still engage in hate speech against them. Examples being, for example, evangelical Christians who engage in hate speech against LGBTQI communities while saying that they love them. So hate speech is not about disliking somebody, or indeed even hurting their feelings. We regulate hate speech legally in most countries, most democracies around the world, with the exception, of course, of the United States, because we regard it as harmful. We regard a hate speech as crossing the line between hurting someone's feelings and actually harming them in a substantive way, in a way that's equivalent to harming them by doing something else. It's comparable to other discriminatory harms, like denying somebody a job or housing on a specified ground. Hate speech is a discriminatory harm that governments in countries like Australia have decided crosses a line and should be regulated. Hate speech is speech that discriminates against people. It marginalises them. This means that the context in which hate speech becomes possible is a context within which the target is marginalised and systemically disadvantaged, and historically and systemically disadvantaged. So, for example, you can't really enact hate speech in a country like Australia against people with blue eyes on the basis that they have blue eyes, because there's no systemic disadvantage faced by people with blue eyes. People with blue eyes may have another ground on which they could become targeted, but it's not the colour of their eyes. There are other examples. The blue eyes one is relatively straightforward. There are other more complex ones. I think, for example, of people who claim racial vilification when they come from a Caucasian or Anglo background. They can be slightly more complicated. So if we understand hate speech in this way, as speech that harms by systemically marginalising and disadvantaging target groups, this limits it in terms of who is capable of saying something that counts as hate speech in the context in which it happens, and who is vulnerable to being targeted by hate speech. And I think this is quite a helpful distinction in understanding who should be able to seek a remedy from hate speech laws. It's also helpful in understanding the line between free speech and hate speech. People, of course, do have a right to free speech. It's one of the foundational core values of a democracy. But like any human right, the point at which that right, the right to free speech, can be limited is the point at which one person's exercise of their right impinges on another person's exercise of the same right. Hate speech laws, I think, are a sensible way of recognising those limits. Hate speech, therefore, is a type of speech that harms. And how does it do this? What are the mechanisms by which words can harm people? Well, in the literature, we say that there are two ways. The first is causally. That is to say that the hate speech causes people to act in a certain way that results in an act of discrimination or violence against the target. So examples of causal harms, of course, include violence being perpetrated against the target group, but also discrimination in housing or in jobs, for example, and also the fact that the target group feels fear and intimidation and loses their ability to associate with people they want to associate with, other members of their community, their ability to speak their language in public, their ability to read newspapers on public transport, those kinds of things. Then there's a second mechanism of harm, which is the idea that hate speech, just in being spoken, harms its targets by ranking them as inferior and by legitimating discrimination against them. That is to say, there doesn't even need to be a separate, causally related incident that happens to make that hate speech harmful. just in saying it, you've harmed the target group because you've ranked them as inferior and you've legitimated discrimination against them. In many ways, you've silenced them, either literally because people are too scared and intimidated to speak back, or in the sense that you've rendered their speech unspeakable. You've rendered, they can say what they want to say, but it doesn't mean what they want it to mean in the world because they're not given credibility, they're not believed, they're not trusted as members of the community. So they can say something is true, but they don't get believed. I've conducted a lot of studies in Australia on vilification and its impact on target communities through my career. In one study, we interviewed 100 members of, my co-investigator and I, interviewed 101 members of target communities around Australia in rural and regional areas, in urban areas, and from a variety of different communities. And we sourced those interviewees without asking them whether they had been subjected to hate speech. And then the first question we asked all of them was whether they or somebody very close to them, a family member, for example, had been subjected to hate speech. And 100% of the people we interviewed said yes to that question. They had experienced hate speech in the workplace, on the streets, at community events, on public transport, in schools, in universities, everywhere you can imagine. We asked them to describe the harms that they felt they had experienced as a result of being subjected to hate speech. And they described a number of things. These included a kind of existential pain. So not just hurt feelings, but a questioning of their validity to exist, which they described in existential terms. Fear of going out, fear of speaking their language, fear of associating with their community. Disempowerment, including disempowerment to act against other acts of discrimination. Withdrawal from expressive opportunities from their community and from the community as a whole, from participating in broader community events. An inability to respond, so being literally silenced. They felt that they were excluded from the community, dehumanised, and that they had a restricted ability to identify with their own community. The harms of hate speech are clearly substantial and very wide-ranging. And now to my personal story. I discovered after my father died that my ancestors on my father's side had moved into Vienna from Eastern Europe, a place called Podacha, which was in Poland and then in the USSR and then in the Ukraine. They moved in the late 1800s, but Podacha was a famous Jewish town and apparently had a very grand synagogue built in 1529, which of course is in ruins today. Prior to World War II, there had already been pogroms against Jews in that town, but by 1939 there were more than 4,000 Jews living there. In 1945, apparently there were 80 left alive. Podacha has 5 Jewish mass graves. My father visited there in 2000 and he was told that in the largest graveyard, all the rabbis are at one end. My great-great-grandfather Elias sent his son, my great-grandfather Adolf Gelber, from Podacha to a German school in Lvov and then to the University of Czernowitz once universities opened to Jews. He then transferred to Vienna University to study law, and 2 of his brothers joined him there. Their father went bankrupt due to anti-Jewish pogroms, and the sons had to support themselves in Vienna. Apparently the three brothers had 1 pair of trousers between them. They made it a family joke. Das war eine Chose, 3 Brüder und eine Hose. Adolf worked as a journalist, a scholar of Shakespeare and an editor of a newspaper in Vienna. And one of the items I found in my father's possessions was an article he'd written called Human Rights in Our Culture. He was friends with artists and musicians, and I discovered he also wrote fairy tales which are still available in German I discovered one that was published in 2017 in an anthology of the favourite Christmas fairy tales. I found original editions of these fairy tales on my father's bookshelf after he died, and I had absolutely no idea what they were. I had to look them up. Among my father's possessions were old photographs, many of them signed. These included a photograph of Conrad Veidt. He is the actor who you may recognise as having performed the role of Major Heinrich Strasser in the Casablanca movie, the one who shot right at the end. He fled Germany in 1933. There was a signed photograph by Edmund Eisler. He was a composer who composed operettas in Vienna. He was very well known prior to World War II. His work was banned by the Nazis, but following the war he was welcomed back to Vienna with the return of a plaque that had been removed from his birthplace under occupation. And there was a beautiful photo of Gisela Springer, who was a pianist soloist with the Vienna Symphonica. She moved from Vienna to Berlin in the 1920s, where she remained until she was deported in 1941 to Lodz, and then in May 1942 to Chemno, where she was murdered. Adolf's son was my grandfather, also called Adolf Gelber. Adolf married Gertrude Altschul, my grandmother, in Vienna in 1924, and Gertrude's family had a leather goods factory which, similar to the previous story, was taken from them when it was Aryanised. Her parents were Max Altschul and Bertha Knopfelmacher. Max and Bertha were both deported to Theresienstadt on the 22nd of July 1942. In May 1944, they were both transported to Auschwitz. Max died in the train on the way there, and Bertha died in July 1944. In 1938, the Anschluss had created deep fear, and my family began looking for places to emigrate, which, as we've already heard, was not easy. My father was sent on the kinder transport to England. His mother also left Vienna, and I don't know how she did that. She made her way to England, and among my father's possessions was a letter of reference written for her in May 1938, from a hotel kitchen, from a hotel manager, and she had worked in the kitchen as a voluntary worker. She wasn't allowed to be paid by that point. It said that she was a wonderful worker, but she'd had to be dismissed from her voluntary employment in the hotel kitchen due to political events in Austria. My father's father was the last to leave Vienna successfully. Through friends, he got word that the borders were closing, and in August 1939, he was told the security services were going to arrest him the next day. The only border where his name had not yet been listed was the Dutch border. So his friends said they'd hold up notification to that border for 24 hours. He slipped across the Dutch border with, as he put it, a toothbrush and the clothes on his back, and made his way to England. After the Anschluss and before they all left, my father remembered anti-Semitic signs scrawled on Jewish shops. He wrote these memories in notes that I discovered after he died. He remembered old men made to wear the Star of David and being on their knees in the street, forced to scrub cobblestones with a toothbrush while being jeered at. He remembered needing to walk softly and bite his tongue, even at home. He wore a swastika in his buttonhole every time he went out. It was very hard to leave. Few countries were accepting refugees, and debates were fearful and anxious. He remembered a mob breaking into the Archbishop's residence at St. Stephen's Cathedral nearby, ransacking it, beating up the priest and burning books. The mob that did this then marched down his street in a row abreast of one another that covered the entire street. They were chanting vicious slogans. He and his family were in the flat upstairs, and his parents also told him to move away from the window, lest they see him, scared that if the mob saw him it would provoke them. He said his parents were terrified and smelled of their fear. One of my father's uncles, Gustav, moved to Brazil and later discovered that more than 23 family members had been killed in concentration camps. There's a lot that's been written, of course, about the beginnings of the Holocaust. I've always found the book Language of the Third Reich by Victor Klemperer to be very instructive. Klemperer wrote this book in 1946. He pointed out that it isn't only Nazi actions that have to vanish, but also the Nazi cast of mind, the typical Nazi way of thinking and its breeding ground, the language of Nazism. Just as it's customary, he said, to speak of the face of an age or of a country, so it is also usual to characterise the spirit of a particular epoch as its language. Nazism permeated the flesh and blood of the people through single words, idioms, and sentence structures, which were imposed on them in a million repetitions and taken on board mechanically and unconsciously. This is one of the most important lessons we can take out of the events of Kristallnacht. It starts with marginalisation. It moves on to dehumanisation. And we've seen where it can end. As contemporary scholars of mass atrocities, Alex Bellamy and Stephen McLaughlin write, all too often a focus on the structural causes and pathways of escalation that lead to mass violence obscures the role of humans. The fact that along the way, leaders made decisions that pushed their countries towards or away from mass violence. Atrocity crimes do not emerge from nowhere. They arise out of deep-seated fear and practices of discrimination, marginalisation, and conflict. My work over the last 25 years has focused on how hate speech is a practice of discrimination, marginalisation, and conflict. Just because it happens with words doesn't make it any less real. I've dedicated my career to helping people understand the harms that some words can inflict and to combating it by emphasising that, like all other human rights, the right to freedom of speech carries with it commensurate responsibilities. The greatest responsibility that we have in exercising our free speech is the responsibility not to harm others with our words. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts with you.
Thank you, Catherine. I would now ask Rabbi Jaffe, the rabbi of the Brisbane Hebrew congregation, to recite the memorial prayer. This will then be followed by the choir singing a song written by Billy Joel and arranged by Philip Lawson. It's called Lullaby, Good Night, My Angel. Rabbi Jaffe?
El Mali Rachamim Shoyechein Bamaroyamim Hamatzei Menucha Nechaina Al Kanafei Ashechina B'Ma'alois Kedoshim Etohirim Kazayarakim Azirim Es Nishmois HaKadoshim Atohirim Shahumsu b'shanargu, b'shanishchatu, b'shanisrafu, b'shanitku, b'shanechnuku al kiddush Hashem, al yedei hatzayrim, hanatzim yemach shemam b'zichrom. Bavu shanachnu mispalim baras kosh nishmoiseihem, בגן עדן תימנוכה וסם. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסייסה כנפיו לעולמים. ויצרור בצרח החיים אס נשמעיהם. אדוני הוא נחלו וסם. וינוחו בשלום המשכבויסיהם. ונאמר Amen. O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence in the lofty levels of the holy and pure ones, who shine like the glow of the firmament for the souls of the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled for the sanctification of the name, and for whose memory we pray. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, may the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shelter of his wings for eternity, and may he bind their souls in the bond of life. Hashem is their heritage, and may they repose in peace on their resting places. Now let us respond, Amen.
To all, hello, that's better. To all our elected members of Parliament and Council here tonight, to members of the Judiciary, to Sarah Kelly, OAM, the Honorary Consul for Israel, Rabbi Jaffe, Shoah survivors and their families, dear friends from many faith communities, and our Jewish community members. Thank you all for coming and participating in this service commemorating Kristallnacht. As President of the Queensland Jewish Board of Deputies, I'm honoured to have attended this commemoration and hear Edgar's story firsthand. On behalf of everyone here tonight and those watching live online, thank you, Edgar, for bravely reliving your horrific memories and for sharing your thoughts and experiences to make this night a truly memorable and life-changing one. But wait, there's more. No. I had the privilege to hear Professor Katharine Gelber speak about her family history, excuse me, a couple of years ago at a UQ Yom HaShoah commemoration. Once again, she eloquently shared her family story. Shared her family story, a personal recount that illustrates how many generations were devastatingly affected by acts of cruelty. Unbeknown to me, of course, her keynote speech tonight was really very appropriate, and I might just diverge from my notes and just say that how appropriate it was for you to use the words you used tonight. It's very appropriate within what's happening in this state and this country as we move towards the change of vilification laws and things, that you should raise this, and that 83 years later, we're standing in a civilised society and we still need to remind our countrymen and all that this is still an issue. And so I hope that Queensland and Australia can be at the forefront to change what's going on and to make it safe for all races and all people, including the elimination of anti-Semitism. So I'd now ask if you could make a presentation to Katharine, please. The performances by the Vox Populus Community Choir, led by Kate Shermer, was truly moving and stirring, perfectly suited to be performed within the surrounds of this beautiful 135-year-old synagogue. Thank you for making your time available for this historically significant commemoration. It has been a privilege to hear about the Suspend Judgment program presented by the students of Brisbane College and led by Rosie Pope. A heartfelt thanks to their teacher and facilitator, Dominic Strahan, and Principal Brendan Carl. Your presentation. Our thanks also go to Rabbi Jaffe for the touching memorial prayer, and to the Brisbane Synagogue President, Aaron Goldman, for hosting this important commemoration in this fitting, historic place for tonight's service. We are honoured to have attendees from the broader community, including representatives from state and federal government departments, the Queensland Museum, the University of Queensland, and Griffith University. Events like tonight take a dedicated group of individuals who work tirelessly behind the scenes, out of the spotlight, sometimes behind it, to make this a truly memorable occasion, including the 11 network team who have live streamed this commemoration so it can be shared with those who are unable to attend in person. On behalf of us all, thank you also to the QJBD Shoah Commemorations Chair and QJBD Committee of Management member Lee McNamee, along with Rocky and Johnny Miller, Eddie Berkowitz, Astrid Werfel, and of course Jason and Gail have been instrumental in ensuring that we get the word out on this very special occasion. So thank you very, very much for all your work. And in closing, to all of you who have made the effort to attend this 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, please take home from this evening's commemoration one key message. We all must do everything we can as individuals and leaders in your communities and organisations to ensure that hate has no home here and this never happens again. Thank you and travel home safely.